Mike. There you go. See, you're fluent in mute. It's an honor to be with you all this morning, like I mentioned. And you know, I started doing this presentation about a year ago because so many different groups that I go talk to now, you know, they ask about negative emotions, and we'll get into that in a little bit. But a lot of times I just try to have a level setting playing field, right? Because I know some of you from Colorado, some of you from outside the state, from around the world, which is great to hear. But it's interesting because in my title, I usually, when I meet with different tribes now, and we talk about land, water, natural, whatever it is, and I say I'm in the Keystone Policy Center, I say we're totally not affiliated with the Keystone Pipeline. Just want to make sure and put that out there right now so that there's no confusion, because the question always comes up here. But in all honesty, we're a nonprofit that is headquartered in Keystone, Colorado, and we have an office here in Denver and an office in DC. And I head up a team that I started after I left the state about 5 years ago to solely focus on building stronger relationships with tribal and indigenous communities. I'm going to talk a little bit of examples of some of that work, what we're seeing in Colorado, why I think Colorado is a pro-indigenous state, through policy and projects that we're working on, but also some things that we have a lot of work to do. So this is usually what I start out with, because I don't know if anybody else is a fan of My Cousin Vinny. Love the movie. You haven't seen it, go see it, you'll recognize this, and specifically this part. Because this part, the judge says, you know, what is a youth, right? But in the Eastern accent of the actors, you know, whenever I heard it, I was like, how can you answer that? That's me. There's only a few of us. So whenever we hear something that's not even related to us, we tend to get excited. But so much of this question comes up in conversation in Colorado because Colorado recognizes the Ute people as the longest residents of the state of Colorado, the longest continuous residents of the state of Colorado. So much of our names, our language is now in wilderness. So if you've ever camped on the western slope of Colorado, in Weebanooch or Yampa or Tawagwatch, those are all names from our people. And Ute actually isn't even a name that came from us. It was given to us by a Spanish expedition, an exploration on the western slope before Colorado was there. A Spanish expedition was going with is near Montrose, Colorado. Came across a group of Mayan people and they jotted down Utes. And in the record, that then translated into Utes. So then Ute stuck. But if you ask me or anybody from my community, we'll say that we're Nuchu, N-U-C-H-U, meaning the people. Now, out of 574 federally recognized tribes throughout the United States, including Alaska, unfortunately, around a little over 200 still actively speak our language today. Now, that's definitely an alarm for a variety of different reasons. And we've actively been trying to revive our Ute language so that this continues on. So I'm fortunate to be able to now have an app on my phone that as I'm driving, I can hear it and learn different names, but this is always where I wanted to start because a lot of times people are like, oh, I mean, you wouldn't believe how many Ute crossings, Ute creeks, Ute mountains, Ute something there are in the state of Colorado. But I think a lot of people, they don't know what is a Ute. It was mentioned a little bit earlier, but everything that I grew up with comes from these individuals, not just my family, my mother, and all the aunties that I have in my community, but the individual on your left is Chief Jack House. He was my great-grandfather. He died in 1971, and he died with that title. We don't have chiefs anymore in my tribal nation. We have elections, we have chairmen and councils and things like that, but he passed away with that title. The individual on the right is my father, Lady Ernest House Sr. He's the longest elected official for my tribal nation. He served for over 55 years. But to give you that type of snapshot picture in Colorado, so throughout the United States, American Indian Alaska Native make up about 2% of the US population. Colorado is very similar. 2% roughly of Colorado's population identifies as American Indian Alaska, represented in all 64 counties of the state. But if we wanted to go a little bit deeper on that, that's about 80,000 people, let's say roughly. And of that 80,000, 80% live here in the Denver metro area. Now, I bring that up because this trend has been going this way for the last 15, 20 years. Actually, we've seen more American Indians moving off reservations to urban areas than we've seen since back in the 70s when Indian centers were being created and assimilation policies were being developed to offer housing and jobs in places like Minneapolis, Los Angeles, Denver. But when they got here or there or San Francisco, like my parents went to, there was nothing there. So they ended up moving back to the reservation. But here, that's even though our two reservations are 7 hours away, this is where the largest American Indian population is. And I probably put the same numbers in Salt Lake, Phoenix, and Albuquerque. We're going to continue to see that growth move forward. And if you were wondering here in the Denver area, which was the largest represented groups, it's members of the Dene Nation, Navajo Nation, and also the Sioux Nations, Lakota, Dakota. So back to who are the youths. These names on the top, you might see from these federal land managing agencies, wildernesses, all this other stuff. But really, there was 7 bands of youths who consolidated to make up 3 tribes today. My tribe is located in Toyoak, Colorado, so we're right on the Four Corners. In fact, if you go to the Four Corners Monument, and who's been to the Four Corners Monument by any chance? And of course, you have to do the leg in each state. Well, whatever hand or leg is in Colorado, you're technically on the Ute Mountain Ute Reservation, and Utah, Arizona, New Mexico is on the Navajo Nation. But unfortunately, when you pay the fee, entry fee, that all goes to the Navajo Nation. We're still in conversations about how that should be. Maybe we'll figure that out one day. But our sister tribe, the Southern Ute tribe, is in Durango, and our other sister tribe in Utah, Fort Duchesne, referred to as Northern Utes in Fort Duchesne, Utah. So here are the bands where we're around the state of Colorado. Like I mentioned, we're nomadic. You people were we're moving with the seasons. And our bands would normally go between high elevations in the summertime, low elevations in the wintertime. But we're always moving. In fact, we utilize teepees, but one of the other temporary housing structures we would have is called wiki-ups. And they're wooden, they look like wooden teepees, but without any cloth or buckskin or buffalo hide around it. And these structures will just still be standing. In fact, a handful of years ago, there was a group out of Grand Junction, Colorado, that did a research project that still found over 400 wiki-ups still standing in the mountains in the western slope of Colorado. So they're still out there. The Yampa and the Grand River bands, they still have a hunting line standing in Rocky Mountain National Park. If you've ever been there. Garden of Gods in Colorado Springs, our last youth fair dance was held in 1908, so we were forcibly removed from that area. So this is just some context of where our bands would be. So here's the state of Colorado as we know it now. I like to say that this whole area was Ute territory at one point, along with other tribes, but just talking about the Utes right now. The first Ute reservation was in 1968. And maybe you've definitely seen this in other maps throughout the United States of land loss. Then we start to see the chunks being taken out. This chunk in southwestern Colorado, if you've ever been there, of course, that's where I'm from, born and raised. I'm a little biased, but it's the best part of the state. But that chunk is the San Juan Mountains. And if you've been to Telluride or Silverton or Uray, you know that there's over 400 miles of tunnels due to mining. And that was one of the biggest impacts that we're still actively having conversations about today. Then, after the development of westward expansion and necessity, all these other policies, then by the late 1880s. Now, I want to go back to this because this is where we started, right? And in 40 years, we went to this. There was an elder that we have in Pacific History, Colorado. He specifically has quotes up on the wall that it was really powerful in when he was talking about history and saying, we've lived here since time immemorial, but in the 1800s, we lost everything in the matter of 40 years. And this is where we are today. The blue line is my tribe, the Yukon Ute tribe, for 300,000 acres in 3 states, including southeastern Utah. We have a community in southeastern Utah called White Mesa, and then our headquarters is in Colorado. We're a communal land on reservations, so we don't have very many checkerboard individual land allotments, which is fascinating given this time frame. Our sister tribe in the red is the Southern Indian tribe. They're checkerboard. They're 300,000 acres. If you ever drive in along Highway 160 from Pagosa Springs to Durango, you'll cross the Southern Indian Reservation over a dozen times and you won't know. You'll see signs, but you'll crisscross on and off the reservation. Why that's important is because of the checkerboard nature and the amount of the jurisdiction and a lot of times lack of jurisdiction that tribes have, which is an ongoing issue still today. So when I mentioned, and even in the land acknowledgement the city of Denver did, I mentioned that Colorado prohibited the state. I had the honor back in 2007 from 04 to 07 to work on pretty landmark process for the state of Colorado. We attempted to do something that no state had done before, which was creating an agreement with tribes that are not only here in Colorado, like the Utah tribe and Southern Utah, but tribes that had been forcibly removed over the last 150 years that had always called Colorado and continue to call Colorado. Today, we refer to them as the 48 historic tribes of Colorado. Now, my tribe and Southern Utah are on this list, but these are the 48 tribes. It took us 3 years to meet with all of these tribes. And it was amazing to me now when I think about it, that we actually got everybody to agree on one policy. And that policy was so important that policy was the only way I think we would have been able to get all of these tribal nations in one room wherever that was located. And that one issue was about the return of Native American human remains and associated funerary objects that are found on public lands that are taken by the state, that are put in our state museum, and that are just left there. In fact, in 2007, Colorado had over 400 Native American human remains that could not be returned to tribes because of lack of policy that would direct state agencies to return those remains back to tribes. So we took it upon ourselves to meet with these tribes. It wasn't a policy, we just presented the issue. The tribes themselves came up with how they wanted the process to be done. So right now, every year, annually, there's between 10 and 15 inadvertently discovered Native American human remains found every year. Now, what that means is you're hiking the Red Rocks, which is a true case. I mean, think of how many people go to Red Rocks and hike around Red Rocks every single day. There was somebody who was hiking on a trail and saw what looked to be like bones of something sticking out, and they called the local law enforcement, coroner, called the state. It created this process where actually that was human remains, and they were Native American, and they went into this process to be returned. All of those 400 remains have since been returned, and were returned actually within the first couple of years. But now the conversation turns to institutions of higher education or local museums who oftentimes don't have the funding. So maybe you've heard, maybe it's the states where you live or museums that you work with. This is a hot topic issue right now, because the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, the federal act, which was meant to return tribes, remains to tribes, has loopholes. And that's what's closing down certain parts of museums right now, because museums are supposed to consult with tribes. But again, it's a pretty big lift. I'm glad we have this process, but we're seeing a lot of times now, these tribes want to come back. They've always wanted to come back to Colorado. But now we're actively seeing the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes in Oklahoma. Maybe they can one day have a headquarters here in Colorado, which they've always called Colorado. So here's a couple articles about land acknowledgements. And I mentioned, like, the love-hate relationship that I have with land acknowledgements. I've seen land acknowledgements done where badly, right? Where it's just performative, it's just checking the box, you feel bad, you want to have somebody come up and give a spiel or whatever else. But then I've seen organizations use that and go beyond the conversation. And that's why I really wanted to preface this whole conversation, where I've seen communities where maybe that wasn't their intent. Their heart was in a good place, but they ended up seeing the commitment and they went for it. Or I've seen other local governments go, you know what? We just don't have the money. We'd love to do it, but we don't know how to do it. Or I want to be supportive. I want to outreach to your tribal community, but I don't want to put my foot in. I don't want to make myself look stupid. I don't want to make an organization look bad. How can I do that? And I think that the more research and commitment that, I mean, our tribes, our community know, right? We're surveyed out. It's funny. I mean, my community, my organization does surveys every time we go out to indigenous communities. I'm like, there's a survey every day that goes to my community. We know the social disparities in our own community. Absolutely. We know we're at the highest rates of everything you can think of. So every group, every health organization, every entity that wants to combat this, that, or the other, wants to come and work with me and say, you know what, if we can change you, we can show the growth, then we're definitely going to put that in our community. We're going to put that in our report. We're going to be able to build that partnership. And I know that's coming from a good place, but just know that there's been so much of that done over the years and so much of that taken from our community without being put back in. So obviously there's a lot of distrust there. And I think the land acknowledgement conversation brings that up. It's the check the box process. And we know those that are out there just to do that. So I hope that throughout this process, it will give you some ideas to build stronger relationships. One of the hats that I wear outside of my day job is I've had the great honor of being on the board of trustees for Fort Lewis College in Durango, Colorado. And Durango, Fort Lewis is a small liberal arts college. We have about 3,000 students. Over 40% of our student body is Native American. Every incoming class represents over 175 tribal nations. It's huge, and it's continuing to grow. But the interesting thing also that people may or may not know, well, actually, I think hope more know now, is we started as an Indian boarding school. We're actually one of 5 Indian boarding schools that were created in the late 1800s and 1900s. And how do you create a college and university with over 40% American Indian student population and want to encourage them to go out and change the world and be change makers when we haven't even begun talking about the most traumatic experience of their or their family's life? And the boarding school issue is something that impacts every American Indian woman. Even if I didn't go, my father was taken when he was 6 and was there. He spent his youngest years, and it formed him, right? What he saw, what he experienced, he didn't talk about it until later. And now we're having a conversation. But when I talk about land acknowledgements, this one that I use as an example, this is the early revision. Actually, it's changed, in which I think land acknowledgements should change. They should evolve. They're living documents, they're living conversations. And the students and the indigenous faculty came together and put this one. But then a year later, they're like, wait, this doesn't reflect what really needs to be reflected. And so that changes. And so that's why I put this up as, yes, land acknowledgements are often just words on a piece of paper. But if we're able to put the examples on what that looks like, we can move forward. After this, I was the chair of the board at the time, so we started reading this before the board meeting. But we're also happy that Fort Lewis College is the only higher education institution in Colorado again that requires that there be an indigenous and enrolled tribal member being on the board of trustees. And I think that type of designation for that college is very important. The other thing is, along with it happening down, we just had our graduation last weekend. And along with happening ground, we also encourage our indigenous students from whatever tribal nation or community you come from, you don't have to just wear your cap. You can wear your traditional regalia if that's what that means and what's important to you. This decolonization, especially in academia, in this conversation around how many degrees that you have, what your research program, I get it, and I respect people that do that work. But especially in these communities, for these indigenous communities, it might be the first person from their tribal community going to college, and they're going back, and they're going to college, started out in such a direct chapter. The other. Oh. The other few things that we're seeing right now in Colorado, and across the United States is this amazing conversation around tribal collaboration, co-management, and land back. The land back movement, we probably all heard it, we've probably been involved with it. That's awesome, it's great. In fact, Bears Ears, I often refer to because Bears Ears was supposed to be, put all the politics aside, Bears Ears was supposed to be the first federally land managed area to have co-management as a part. That was supposed to have started everything. So then obviously the politics and everything that came with it. But now it's hopeful to see that a lot more federal land being designated has either a co-management or land back processing reports. I think we still have a long ways to go. I talked over here a little bit on the left side about the city of Denver donating bison to tribal nations. We're seeing that more and more. We're seeing the conversation around in Northern California, returning of the redwoods to a coalition of tribes. Those type of land back initiatives. The other thing though, it's kind of tricky is, so the list that I just put up there, 48 tribes of Colorado. Let's say here in the middle of Denver, we're in the most downtown Denver spot you can be where history was started. If we were to do land back of Metro State where we're sitting right now, that could be up to 48 tribes, realistically, and possibly more, because there could be more tribes on that 48. Just because that's that number of 48 doesn't mean it can grow if tribes want to provide that information. It's not meant to just stay at 48. And so that's where it becomes tricky. So conversations around conservation groups now that I work with, like the Nature Conservancy and Trust and Public Lands, are all asking questions of, okay, how can we return land if it's more than just one tribe? It's fine if we know that, okay, yep, this area over here, we know that that's Ute Mountain, and we're gonna just work directly with Ute Mountain. But what happens when it's 5 tribes, 10 tribes, 20 tribes, 40 tribes? That's the effort, and that's where I'm hopeful to see that people will still have a commitment, because I think there's a path forward to it. And I think the coalitions that we're starting to see on rebuilding around the land back movement are huge. This Japita Rising celebration right here in the middle, this was actually in Salida, Colorado, which is a mountain town, small community. This was like 10 years ago. They did this on their own. Here in Colorado, we love our 14ers, our 14,000 foot peaks. We have 13ers as well. There's a 13,000 foot peak right outside Salida. The community gathered, worked with the tribe to rename it before renaming was a thing. And that was the way that they started looking at how to support that. The other example that I'll provide is the city of Boulder. This is a local government conversation. Now, when folks ask me a lot of times what I do, I'd say, well, I work on policies at the federal, state, and local level, but really it's to change the public's perception of the American Indian. And what I mean by that is consultation. I also have a love recognition because it's so formal, right? Like I encourage people, especially if you're new to working with Indian country and you have a tribal community, I encourage people just to go out there, just to drive out, go to an elder center, go to a community event, total class. Do whatever, introduce yourself to people, go out for coffee, break bread, and then you get the communication process going. I almost think that's almost, obviously, you probably would agree that that's more effective than consultation. You say the term consultation, it creates this very formal process. And there's a place for that. I don't want to overlook that, especially when it comes to the federal government, because there's fiduciary responsibilities and yada yada. But the city of Boulder just has been working on, it's probably the first local government in the state of Colorado that is creating an agreement with 16 tribes. And that's the most at a local government level that I've seen here in the state. And it's all about parks and open space. It's about this growth of Denver. It's about coming out of COVID and seeing Colorado just blow up with the amount of people just out at Colorado's map. They can live in cool Colorado and go do an Instagram selfie and Bell. I'm not talking about those people. I'm talking about the people who are like, oh, I want to move here and I want to live in Boulder because crime is there and I want to go see you and all this, great stuff with the recognition that everyone's getting. But what has been alarmful to a lot of the indigenous community is the growth of the population, especially on the front page. has limited or negatively impacted some of the known and unknown sacred sites that we have along the front range. Now, remember, when I started this whole conversation, tribes have, this has always been a crossroads for numerous different tribes, 50 plus, over hundreds of years. And the ability to go back to certain areas to collect medicinal plants or to collect lava rocks for sweat lodge or certain elements or along this front range corridor that you can't find anywhere else in the state. And when you have the growth of different housing structures and just everything that population growth brings, we find ourselves having to have additional protection of these areas so that they can still be accessed, they can still be available to tribal communities. So City of Boulder went into a process, they created these agreements, they came up with this whole consultation area, but what was even better was they started training their staff. And they started training their city council. Their city council on an annual basis gets a training on the tribal history, on the work that's being done, on the efforts moving forward, the co-management opportunities, the land back opportunities. Now it started ongoing conversations that I never thought possible, even in the last 10, 15, 20 years, where I've seen some of these conversations go across Colorado. And here's just even more. Now I want to bring you to this one. And who's read this book? Brady Sweetgrass. That's awesome. It's great to see. I love, respect, appreciate Professor Kimmer's work. If you have never had a chance to listen to or YouTube or podcast, I encourage you to do that. And I've given this book out to so many different people. But no matter what we call it, TEK, TIK, traditional and indigenous ecological knowledge, this is a buzzword right now. There's so many federal agencies that talk to me and ask me about, can we put this, can we include this in the report? Can we include this as a part of it? And I love it because finally, through a lens that I feel like professors of research, indigenous professors of researchers like Professor Kimmer can only do and others, they're blending, they're braiding that traditional knowledge with Western science. Terms that, others with numerous degrees can understand and recognize. And in a way, it's leveling the playing field. But at the same time, it's also putting this false pretense out there that you could just email me or email an elder in my community and say, hey, can you send me your tribal ecological knowledge? Can you send me a file on that you can share with me and I can just add automatically into my report? Folks, and I'm tired folks are some laughing about that because that's not that easy. And in fact, it comes from years and years of that partnership and relationship. That maybe one day, through your work, through communicating with elders in the community, you get the chance to break bread and order coffee. Somebody tells you a story that relates to the work that you're doing about the land, air, the water, the project that's going on. That's tribal ecology. That's tribal indigenous. And with that comes power. And the reason why I think so many in my community are fearful is that so often that information has been taken from us and it's been never returned. And it's been given away, or it's been put into this process or that process. I'm not saying that tribal ecological is not important knowledge, or TEK, whatever we call it. But I'm trying to emphasize the importance of the relationship building more so. And because I think that's where our communities see the movement. If you're wanting to move the needle in any country of diabetes or education or workforce development, or capacity building, or philanthropic outreach, or community engagement, whatever it looks, it all starts with partnership. The last thing, I think that's the last thing, but the last thing is something that I always tell our team, and it's something that I continuously live by. Collaboration happens at the speed of trust. We have to really truly believe and engage in that because there's so much trust, there's so much mistrust within the tribes in Colorado the last 150 years. I'm not just talking about in the Western time frame of history. We often think through our schooling and upbringing is that history starts in 1876. Or in Colorado, that's 1876, that's Colorado State, or 1776. It doesn't go beyond or even before that. When as indigenous people, we're always taught that the timeline started way before. And it continues along this continuing process. And so the need for local and tribal collaboration, state agencies, we can debate that they're required to do it. I would definitely debate that they should do tribal consultation. Federation, absolutely. Local governments, that's still up there. You know, I think Boulder, others have provided examples, but now we're starting to see the role of NGOs. NGOs that are not required, you don't have a fiduciary responsibility to do outreach. Is it bad practice? Absolutely it is. Is it going to see and encourage the outreach that you do, run your commitment? Totally. But these are some of the things that I think that I've seen where I've actively, with my own eyes, I've seen that type of relationship start to move forward. And it grows, and it creates this long-standing relationship. The Comanche Nation of Oklahoma never thought that they would be best in the city of Boulder. Never. Not at all. It wasn't on their radar screen. Now it is. Now, anytime that there's an opportunity to invite to an event, whatever else, you know they're going to be there. And I think that's what a possibility is for your process. Like I mentioned at the very beginning, you know, it's always an honor to talk the history that we have with our tribal nations, our tribal people. I want to obviously preface this by saying, you know, my tribe is a little over 2,000 members. We're a small tribal community. There's so many other tribal nations, people here represented. And I know that the conversation that you'll have today and other sessions will highlight and elevate their voices. And I just really encourage you and I thank you for the focus for this conference and around community. And so often, I remember my father as a tribal leader going to DC, giving speeches all the time about whatever it was. He would always say, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And I think for a lot of our Native communities, that's been it. We can point to the very first slide, around 2% of the population. That's hard to find if you're 2%. But you really have to work for it because we're here. We're vibrant, we're a fast growing population, and just really encourage you as you define community that you always include us. And so with that, I just want to thank you for the opportunity. And I don't know if there's time to do questions, but happy to open it up if there are.
Ernest, thank you so much. As always, another great talk, and just really you live out the values of the Feedback conference, and we have so much more to learn from Ernest. So just truly thank you. We're gonna open it up for questions for Ernest. I've got a wireless mic that I can run over to you. So I've got about 10 minutes for that. I'd love to.
There are some questions, please.
Yes, no them.
Hi, I'm Serena Margaret, and I'm coming from New York City, where we're facing an influx of migrants, many of them indigenous, and thank you for your presentation today on American Indians, particularly such a hyper-local presentation. But wondering, for those of us that work with indigenous communities that have migrated here because of globalization and U.S. policies elsewhere, and really those that, you know, were was created, but really, kind of, what are some of your recommendations in bringing them to the conversations where that population exists locally? And what are your thoughts about bringing them to larger conversation federally as indigenous people that are displaced because of our actions elsewhere?
Such a great question. And I think the best way has been to bring different voices to the table. And obviously I'm from one perspective. And I think there are definitely others within the indigenous community who may or may not agree with me on landing or have a very particular, have other examples. And I think being able to bring those out is helpful. What I will say though too, is kind of looking at the state of Colorado, and we're involved in a lot of different things from around the state. this re-education of the general public around American Indian Indigenous history is so important. And I use the two terms separate, by the way. Even when I created our center, the Center for Indigenous Engagement, I think that there are groups in Colorado, in southern Colorado, I would identify as indigenous, who've always been there. The border didn't cross, they didn't cross the border. And they've always been here for statehood. They've lived through, this is the third government in New Mexico, Spain, Mexico, and the United States. And so those groups have always been indigenous to those areas. And then you have tribal groups that are federally recognized, that are political organizations and entities that are identified as, you know, what would the federal government call them? The fiduciary responsibilities that control that. Now, I will say that in that re-education effort, I've seen so many more voices step up and say, yes, the American Indians, you know, at the beginning of the United States have horrible immigration policies. You know, that's a very interesting conversation. But what I've seen it how it relates to today is a lot of indigenous groups and tribal groups in the United States now are recognizing and they're standing up and giving space for other groups that they're seeing happen, going through what happened to us in South America or in New Zealand, the Maori people, or First Nations in Canada, or what's going on in the Middle East. So different conversations are happening from different perspectives. And I always think that that's great. I think that that's, you know, what my history is important to me. I'm a history buff, obviously, but I think that's why history is there, because we should be learning from it and not attempting to redo that. Or see it play out, because I think that's what we end up seeing. And it's often said that history has been written by the victors. And I think for the American Indian community, the fact that we've been able to sustain all of this policies and things that's one of our biggest impacts, is that we're a resilient community. We've had to be resilient to go through all this process. And I think a lot of times people, and we'll look at others in the community and say, well, aren't you prepared to talk about this? Like, this is such a downer issue, man. Gosh, like, man, it's tough. Like, gosh, you're going through all kinds of trauma. But in Colorado, American Indian history is not required in public school system in the state, believe it or not. That's one area where we have yet to. We've tried numerous times. There are other policies that we're moving towards that have happened in the last couple of years, but that's not one of them. And I think that's why we continuously have to educate. And I think by raising that awareness, hopefully it also gives ways and examples of other groups going through similar impacts that are still fighting for rights today. Thank you for the question.
Other questions? Got some in the back here.
Hi, I'm Bill Fuller. I actually moved to Colorado originally in 1978. In earnest, I was literally about to talk about education. I lived in an unincorporated area called Applewood, Golden, Colorado, for people who know. And as you were talking, I was thinking about the fact of all the things I learned about history, you know, from the history of China, Russia, all these things. But as you said, the history of the indigenous people of Colorado haven't been talked about. So to hear you say it's still not talked about, what can we do in this space? What can those of us as philanthropy organizations, foundations, help to change that? Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you for the question. And obviously, I mean, look, I've worked for politicians before, and I think there's a political conversation there. You know, the usual reach out to your local elected official. That, you know, I think too, that yes, that's important, because I think American Indian history is our shared history. Even the boarding school, the land loss, all the difficult stuff, that's our shared history. When we talk about all the time in this country and in Colorado, the fabric of all of our history is the fabric of what makes America great, what makes Colorado great. But I think a lot of times in Colorado, we're reluctant to look at that history and do a deeper dive. And does it make people feel uncomfortable? I'm sorry, yes, it does, let's just be honest with that, but we've learned that in these spaces, we have to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. And part of that is going through that process. And one of those things, and so besides reaching out, yes, to the elected officials, I would encourage that your organization also reach out to the education institutions of the state. In Colorado, the Colorado Department of Education, other organizations that help support them to help elevate the need for this. This last legislative session in Colorado, there was an attempt. For those who don't know, it's 120th session from January to May, just did last week or the last couple of weeks. And there was an attempt to run a bill, but again, it was met with controversy and it broke down and it ended up being a resource. I put a resource guide together with other elders in my community for fourth grade students in Colorado, which Colorado students talk about Colorado history in fourth grade statewide, and we included a youth resource guide. Well, what about the other tribes? What about the other history that's important to Applewood specifically, or what would help those? And I think the resources that teachers need to know that there are professors like Robin Kimmerer and others that are putting in amazing books, like They're There, other indigenous novels, and we've seen so much growth in multimedia in the indigenous realm that it's something, it's amazing to see that, you know, Reservation Dogs on Hulu can be an all indigenous cast by an all indigenous produced group, by an all indigenous scores and songs and across the board. That's amazing, you know, and so I think that there are more resources now for educators specifically to be able to draw and get the attention of young people, A. But B, to change that policy is to be able to reach out to those local elected officials to say that it's not just because where the tribes are located, those representatives should be engaged in this conversation, that it's actually a statewide process. So the other thing I'll highlight is, and I didn't put it up on here, but one of the things that has been really impactful for Colorado that I had, direct experience with was when our former governor, John Hickenlooper, who's now our state senator, issued an apology on behalf of the state of Colorado for the Sand Creek Massacre. Sand Creek Massacre happened in 1864 and 1874, excuse me, and it was a complete massacre by the U.S. cavalry. Colorado wasn't a state at the time, and yet that event, and it was massacring men, women, and children, over 200, about 3 hours away from here. In 2007, there was, 2005, there was a National Historic Site designated for Park Service called Sand Creek Massacre. If you have a chance, if you're ever driving on the Eastern Plains, I encourage you to go look at that. But that was the starting point for us to start looking and having difficult conversations about our Colorado past. And I remember taking a resolution in front of the state legislature to recognize, commemorate those losses of Cheyenne and Navajo people. And I vividly remember one time going to some legislators and they're just like, "We can't read this. This is too gruesome. The words are too strong." And in essence, I think what they were saying is it puts us in a bad light, is what the conversations are. But even how to talk about it, now that that process has passed and we have this apology and everything else, first thing I remember telling the governor at the time was, look, if we do this, because we talked about it for a while, so if you do this, you can't just think that now everything's fine. Like, oh, okay, great, we can stop, and we're good, we're fine. All that stuff's gone, just because you did the apology in the 150 years, this is for the 150. And that was almost some of the most impactful conversations of seeing our state leaders starting to grapple with how they're going to have that conversation. And I get there are some conversations that you maybe should not have a curriculum developed for younger students versus high school students. That's totally fine. But a lot of this conversation, if it's boarding schools, if it's the Sand Creek Massacre, things that happen that should be taught in our K-12 system. And it's that type of education and not just sweeping it under the rug like we've been doing. And I think we're getting closer and closer to that. In fact, now we have exhibits in History of Colorado. Now we're talking about now the boarding school legislation actually passed a couple weeks ago, so there'll be expansion on more research talking about oral histories and taking testimony from families on how they were impacted. Like I said, my dad did start talking about boarding school the last couple of years of his life. And I had this boarding school conversation happen right now. I'm hopeful that it would have helped him come out a little bit more. And maybe address some of the demons that he had struggled with. And that's some of the conversations that our students, our initiative students are studying about some of these policies.
Ernest, we have time for one more question.
Well, thank you so much for being so generous with your time today. I feel like we got so lucky. The 48 tribes of Colorado is just such a beautiful reminder of the uniqueness of all of these individual tribes, and this is such a global challenge of Indigenous rights. And so I wonder, you mentioned the Maori and reconciliation work in Australia, and tribal laws appear in constitutions of countries across Africa, for example. I wonder how you see the United States stacking up in the globe, and what lessons can be learned from work that's being done outside of the US.
Another great question. Well, I think those examples have put some really strong paths forward. You know, when we look at land acknowledgements and recognition of Indigenous cultures and history, you know, those also were after a part of it. They are happening with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada. They've been going on with recognizing Maori for quite a while, and then Aboriginal cultures in Australia. I think we continuously, and then even seeing the impact of Indigenous communities in South America or Central America, should start this conversation on a much more global scale. And I think one of those areas that at least we've had this conversation in our work has been around the advancement of ethnic, free, prior, and informed consent, and the establishment of ethnic at the United Nations level. I think the Declaration on Indigenous Rights, Indigenous Peoples, is huge. You know, depending, no matter who is in leadership for the United States government, the fact that giving space for Indigenous cultures to address this issue at UN or other areas is hugely helpful. I will also say too that there's been some conversations that I've been a part of around the advancement of science and technology with our Indigenous cultures that is also very, very alarming. Especially when we start talking about CRISPR technologies, gene editing, you know, those type of that impact Indigenous communities, and even looking at doing Ancestry.com and 23andMe. You know, those conversations started with identifying, which is a question we all have. Like, where do my people, it's a question that I have, it's a question everybody has. But I think that type of technology that's moving faster and not including our tribal communities is hugely alarming. And I think free, prior, and informed consent is something that a lot of our many Indigenous scholars in the United States are trying to elevate to the UN level to say this needs to be not only adhered to, but expanded and supported on a global scale. But I think that policies, especially like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, is something that the state of Colorado can identify and see and move towards. I will say that, you know, I'll end with this. If you didn't take away, if all of this says at least one thing, it's that, you know, I'm coming from a perspective that, yes, the federal tribal relationship is important, and I respect that. There's treaties, there's a federal trust relationship and obligation that we always need to adhere to. States is interesting because you can see throughout the United States, at least the issues and the cases going before the US Supreme Court, they start between tribes and states. If it's access to voting, like in the Dakotas, we've seen, and the ongoing issue there, the governor now is, I think, I don't know how many tribes are allowed to vote, I think the 5th tribal nation community right now. It's very interesting. Going down to Oklahoma, the completely, you know, the discommunication between tribal nations and the state, talking about annexation and jurisdiction issues, Indian Child Welfare Act issues, the things that we've seen in the US Supreme Court over the last couple of years those start at the local level, they start at the state level, and then they go and make the way through the process. That's why I feel like this relationship building is so important at the state level. And I think that, yes, we have the ability to say that we come from a pro-indigenous, pro-indigenous state. We have so much more work to do. But hopefully we can also provide those examples to other states where we're saying, you know what, just last year, Colorado became the first state to have tribal members, which is going to be a tribal approved process, automatically register to vote in state elections when they go and update their driver's licenses. That was an unheard of thing 3 years ago. But now it's a conversation that's going on. Why that's important is because it gets more of our indigenous people to say, hey, maybe I can run for office. Or maybe I can see myself as the next governor or senator of the state of Colorado. Thank you again so much. I appreciate that.
Really, for showing up, not only with all your knowledge, but so much heart and really towards this path of healing and how we can move forward together. So couldn't have started out this summit better. Thank you so much. Pass it over to Annie to give us an update on the business. Thank you all.
Almost that for our first day. Take 3. Here we go. How was that for our first session? All right, so your next breakout session will start promptly at 10:45. So you've got some time to take care of logistics, meet some new people, some things that may aid in this break time is that the restrooms are directly out back doors, where the registration table was, and then to the right. That's also